So welcome back to another video. This one is the introduction and conclusion chapters of your thesis. Now I've combined the two chapters together in this video because I do think there's an important link between these two chapters. And in this video I'm going to show you a few little bits and bobs, sort of what are the main sections of each chapter, and the most important thing is how they're connected. So the first section of this video is going to focus on the introduction chapter. Now the introduction chapter has a few different sections. It can differ between thesis and, say like a qualitative or a quantitative thesis, or even different fields have their own version of the introduction chapter, but I would say 90% of the time an introduction chapter will start off with a background to the research, which is essentially a mini lit review. You're going to dovetail from that into your research question and objectives. Here's the question, and here's 3 or 4 objectives in how I'm going to answer that question. The section afterwards then is going to be your thesis outline. A lot of people, when they're asked to summarize the chapter in the thesis outline section, will simply just put chapter 3 is the methodology, chapter 4 is the findings. You need to give a little bit more detail than that. So say for instance, if you're doing the methodology summary, you basically say methodology chapter will include the following: sampling, data analysis, ethical considerations, that sort of stuff. So just a little bit of detail, but not too much detail. It functions as a lay of the land or an overview of the bigger picture. So you're basically looking to put in some details that are going to appear in the lit review, but not so much that it becomes its own little literature review. In this section, offer background information about the broader field or subject area into which your research is situated. So that helps contextualize your research, shows a little bit of understanding, gets people sort of ready for what's to come. And as I mentioned earlier on, that's going to dovetail into the rationale, reasoning for doing your research. So you've identified a gap, you've sort of said to yourself, okay, well, I think there's merit in pursuing this line of thought. So I'm just going to go into a bit more detail about the research question and objectives section. That can also include hypotheses. So don't be discouraged if you're hearing me just say research question and you're kind of saying to yourself, well, where's the hypothesis? It's just substitute one for the other. The big things, I know it sounds really small and petty, but if you have a research question, make sure it's in the form of a question. So just put the question mark at the end of it. There's a few schools of thought as to whether you should have sub-questions or research objectives. Personally, I prefer objectives because sometimes research questions, they can become a bit muddled. They can sort of join in with the actual research question, and especially if you're working on a few different drafts, you can sort of lose the thread of it. So I think objectives are much more easier to navigate in someone's thesis. Make sure that you don't use interchangeable terms. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying there about research questions versus objectives. Well, I suppose the big one is interview questions and research questions. So your research question is what guides the thesis, and your interview questions or survey questions is what guides the data you're going to collect to answer that research question. So just be very careful when you use the term questions in your thesis. Just clarify it. Make sure you say research question. Now I spoke at the beginning of this video of a link between the introduction and conclusion, and that link is the research question. Frequently when I'm correcting someone's thesis, I'll see a conclusion chapter with no mention of the research question and objectives. That's a big no, and a big question mark over your sort of ability to understand the point of your thesis. So when I see someone's introduction chapter and I see the research objective and their research objectives and the research question, I think, okay, well now I have a sort of a working map to guide me through it. So when I get to the end of the thesis and there's no mention of the research question or how it's been answered, even though within the thread and the arguments in the conclusion chapter, especially in the summary of the thesis, there is that attempt to show that they have answered that question, and how the objectives have worked towards that goal. But unless you explicitly state to me the purpose of this thesis was blah blah blah, and it has done so by following the following objectives, unless you state that out loud, I'm just going to assume, did they actually know what they were doing, or did they just sort of come to it by complete accident? So it might sound like a very minor thing, but always mention in the conclusion chapter that you have answered your research question, that you have followed the objectives, and show your workings of how you answered your research question. If we were to look at a conclusion chapter structurally, it would follow basically a number of sections. So it would have a conclusion section, which would be the first section of the chapter, and it would basically be, as I mentioned in the last section, a restatement of the research question, a restatement of the objectives and how you answer them, and then a summary of your findings and how your findings have answered that research question. Be very careful with repetition and just retreading the discussion chapter, but you should have some mention of the most important links between your own findings and the literature review there. Now, the next section from that will be recommendations for future research. So you basically said, here is everything I have found by answering the research question, but there's going to be gaps, there's going to be limitations. And the limitations could be something like, you ran out of time, the thesis wasn't, the sample size for the thesis wasn't large enough, or maybe you chose qualitative over quantitative. You might see the merit in doing a different type of approach, or you might see the merit in doing a mixed methods approach. So those are some of the sort of basic recommendations for future research. But there are some more complicated ones you can mention. Now, I mentioned recommendations for future research, but frequently you do find those two, that sentence detached into two. So you can see a section called recommendations, and you can see a section called future research. Both more or less the same. And it really does depend on the thesis, whether you're taking your learnings and your findings back to your own sector or your own company, or if you're just recommending for future students different avenues they can take. If you want a tip for the recommendations or future research section, it's basically to back up what you put down there with something from your lit review. So it's always good if you're giving some sort of recommendation, that it's a recommendation that has been mentioned before. Now, technically there's a bit of an issue with this, in that everyone's recommendation is supposed to be like a call to arms that someone picks up and runs with it. So if you're just mentioning that, well, someone recommended this years ago, and I'm noting that it's been recommended, but I'm not doing anything about it, there might be a bit of an issue there. Sometimes you might see a recommendation that, in a previous study, it might have been said that a larger sample size would have been more beneficial. And in your recommendation, you can note that, let's say Thompson and Mallon recommend a larger sample size would have been beneficial, and you're also recommending this, but just go the extra distance and say that a mixed method study would help gather a bigger cohort of people. So always mention a recommendation that has been said before and just add to it, and then push it out there for everyone else. So ultimately, the conclusion is just going to wrap up your thesis. As I said, it's going to mention the research question, it's going to mention the objectives, it's going to summarize, and then you're going to give recommendations and stuff for future research. One of the things I see the most is people talking about the wow factor. So a supervisor might say, it needs the wow factor. It needs something just a bit extra to get it over the line. Now, I have a particular issue with this because I think a thesis should just end. It should just give recommendations and just end. It doesn't need a quote from Gandhi, a quote from JFK. It doesn't need a piece of poetry stuck at the end of it. You of course can have a final word or two saying you're hoping that it brings change to the sector or field, and that's perfectly fine. But just leave it at that. Don't raise any more questions. Don't bring any new literature into it. Because if at the end of your thesis you raise a question and you mention literature there, I'm just going to say, well, how come this wasn't mentioned in the lit review? How come your whole thesis didn't take stock of this? So just be very careful with ending on a high note, because you could end up confusing the examiner reading it. The examiner could be just thinking, well, hang on a sec, this is a very good point actually. Why wasn't this mentioned before? And more importantly, why hasn't this student mentioned it in their thesis? So whenever I hear the wow factor, just end your thesis. There's no need, just impress us with the thesis itself and not some final paragraph. Not the purpose of your thesis is not to, it should inspire through its content, but it should never have a blatantly obvious inspirational quote or inspirational closing on it. Once you provide the recommendations, that's a signal to the examiner that, okay, this is over, this is done and dusted. So when you try and sort of pull them back in, they're kind of saying, oh no, I want to check out of this. I don't want to continue reading inspirational stuff at the end that sort of dovetails into other stuff, and worse, raises even more questions. So yeah, just end your thesis and you'll be fine. Hopefully this video has shown you why the two are together. The next few videos are going to focus on the literature review, the methodology sections, but most importantly, the methodology section in relation to a qualitative, quantitative, or mixed. I'm also going to look at the findings chapter, discussion chapter, referencing, and some of the finer details regarding flow, academic writing, and some stuff on critical engagement. So that's it. So I'll see you in the next video.